Combat. It's a critical part of any game that includes it, and if it's bad, players notice it immediately. And the rest of the game basically has to pick up the slack for it. Now, obviously, this is not something I want for my game. I want to make the best possible melee combat system for an RPG that's possible. To be honest, I would say that most of the first-person RPGs that have come out in recent years have had very, very lackluster melee combat that have lacked depth and don't really even feel that good. But I want to change that. Now, obviously, this is a very, very tall mountain to climb, and it's going to be quite tricky, but I think we can do it. So, where do we start? Firstly, what I wanted to do was find the best melee combat in the gaming industry and find out what were they doing right. The 3 games I narrowed this down to, personally for me, was Darktide, Vermintide 2, which obviously can be put in similar bubbles, they're very similar games, and also Chivalry 2. All of these games do things very differently, but their melee combat is absolutely superb and incredibly satisfying. So, I played a ridiculous number of hours of all of these games to try and work out and analyze what exactly made them so special. Afterwards, I determined that Chivalry 2 and the Tide games are satisfying for very different reasons. Chivalry 2 succeeds because of its mechanical depth and intense skill-based gameplay, whereas the Tide games are successful because of how they feel. The impact in the combat feels incredibly visceral. First, let's focus on Chivalry 2. You can block, riposte, parry, block break, feint, power attack, special attack, and jab. In a multiplayer setting, especially in their 1v1 game mode, this becomes an awesome version of rock, paper, scissors. Along with that, you can also start to read your opponent and get into their patterns and then counter them appropriately. This depth is incredibly rewarding for the player, but it does rely on having an intelligent opponent, or opponent that responds realistically. I noticed this when fighting against their AI enemies. You could essentially just basic attack them until they died. You didn't have to think so much. So to have that kind of depth, you have to make sure that the AI is responding in a realistic or at least seemingly intelligent way. Now for Vermintide and Darktide. The actual melee combat is quite basic. There is a light attack, a heavy attack, a block, and a push. But your moveset is also determined by the type of weapon you're using, so that does add variation. So if you're using a sword, you'll be slashing, but if you're using a spear, you'd mostly be jabbing. The reason these games feel so good can be summed up in one word for me, and that one word is impact. When you hit enemies, you are sending rats flying across the room as they respond to the force of your weapons. Or they play several different specific hit reaction animations to really sell the impact from the player's attack. Along with that, they mix having creative death animations for enemies, along with just ragdolling them across the room to create more variation in the experience. A big part of this is also how weapons respond. On unarmored enemies, your weapon will glide straight through them and hit other enemies that are near them. But on heavy, large enemies or enemies that are wearing heavy armor, the weapons essentially bounce off them realistically, almost like you're hitting a wall. The audio design for this game and for their weapons is also immaculate. The weapons have unique sounds when they hit certain objects and certain surfaces, so it really sells the experience and the actual realism of your attacks and the impacts that they create. Now, understanding this is all good and well, but how can I actually use this information? Chivalry 2 succeeds because it's a multiplayer game, and the Tide games succeed because their combat system is specifically designed for fighting hordes and hordes of enemies and making that feel great. What this did teach me was the value of making sure the player feels the impact of their weapons, and to make sure that the combat has weight to it. It also taught me a few ways of doing that. It also taught me that you can make the player feel good by making them feel skillful in the way that they defeat their opponent. Using this knowledge, I could start improving my own combat system, which was honestly really difficult in the beginning. I started off using collisions to determine when my weapons were hitting enemies, and this was a massive mistake for a huge list of reasons. So I used a system called tracing to check for when my weapon was hitting enemies. But my first implementation resulted in some missed hits, and this is because it was reliant on the frame rate. If there was a frame drop, it was possible for the weapon to glide through an enemy and for it to not register that it had hit. And this is because if there wasn't a frame where the weapon was exactly touching the enemy, it wouldn't trigger, even if it looked like to the player that the weapon went through them. So I had to scrap this idea too. Eventually, I had to get a little bit creative and do a lot of research, and I came up with a solution that works really, really well, still using tracing, but in a more creative way. And now it's very, very reliable. Along with this, I also made a bunch of first-person animations and also ensured that if a player hit a hard target or wall with their weapon, it would bounce off realistically. Now specifically, what can a player do? You can dodge from side to side. You can also dodge backwards. You can block, and if you block just before an enemy's attack lands, it'll be parried, stunning them for a moment and creating an opening for the player. Along with that, there's also your standard flowing melee combo, and a heavy attack, an attack from block, and a thrust. The thrust has more range but won't hit as many enemies per swing. It also allows the player to be more accurate with their attacks in case they're fighting alongside friendly NPCs. Though, to be honest, I'm still debating how I would like the thrust to work. I would like to highlight that this system is iterated on almost daily, and it's probably changed on my side by the time you've watched this video, and it's nowhere near to completion, but it's getting there. Now this is just the combat basics. When a player first enters the world and their character picks up a melee weapon, these are the things that they will be able to do. But as their player improves their skills and learns new things, new combat melee abilities will be made available to them, much like how a magic-based character might learn new spells. I'll be speaking about the ability and magic systems in a future video though. Just a quick reminder to please like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content and you're enjoying the video. It really helps the channel. And yeah, back to the video. Now that I could hit things, I needed something to hit. So thankfully I'd already made 2 sets of armor for the specific faction in the game, and maybe I'll get into more depth about them in the future, but for now we're focusing on mechanics. At the moment I have a melee enemy and a ranged enemy. All enemies can follow patrol routes, and when they spot the player they will chase after them. If the player breaks line of sight long enough, the enemy will return to their patrol route. This is very basic right now and still needs a ton of work and a bunch more depth. When a melee enemy fights a player, they will alternate between getting into melee range to attack and backing up to create a more realistic combat dynamic. They have 3 main attacks right now: a default attack that can be parried, a long combo attack that cannot be parried, only blocked, and an infrequent unblockable kick attack that pushes the player back a bit and slows their movement speed whilst preventing them from attacking. This is essentially used as a stun against the player and encourages them to have to dodge that specific attack. I'm debating whether the enemies should also strafe around the player during combat. I do have a system that works perfectly for this that I already made, but I removed it because it made the fights really, really challenging, because you would often end up getting just surrounded and stabbed in the back. And I'm not exactly sure I want the combat to be that realistic, but I'll play around with it a bit and see. Ranged enemies are quite simple at the moment. They fire crossbow bolts at the enemy and attempt to keep distance away from the player. I'm working on having them also transition into light melee enemies when the player gets too close to them with a melee weapon. I also made sure that the ranged enemies don't just fire where the player currently is, but rather where they're going to be. This makes them way more accurate when they're trying to hit the player when the player's actually moving around. I'm currently working on the ranged combat system for the player and on the magic and ability system, as I mentioned before. And honestly, they're coming along really well and they fit into the combat really, really nicely. So I'm really excited to show you guys. New enemy types such as healers and mages are also in development, but they still require a little bit of work. Tying this all together, I made sure to utilize different hit reactions on the enemy characters, depending on the direction the attack was coming from. I couldn't allow hit reactions, which I refer to as being staggered, to always take place, because otherwise it was possible to stun lock an enemy by hitting them quickly. It's a balance I'm still trying to find, and I think the chance to be staggered should probably be determined by the melee weapon that the player is using, and also how skilled they are with it, and maybe also the size or type of enemy that they're fighting. Though, there's still a lot to work out there. I mixed ragdolling enemies when they are defeated, along with death animations for visual variety. And I also included a dismemberment system, because it's just kind of fun. A ton of work has gone into this, and there is still so much to do. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video and enjoyed learning more about it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, that always helps. And if you have any thoughts or feelings about the video, and maybe you have some suggestions or any cool ideas or changes that you would make, I would love to hear from you guys, so please feel free to leave a comment down below. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.